The highway stretched endlessly under the oppressive glare of the moon, a vein of concrete slicing through the barren desert. It was the kind of road that seemed to exist outside of time, where radio signals faltered and the horizon looked like a mirage. They called it Devil's Corridor, though no one could quite agree on why. Some said it was the fatal car crashes, others the eerie disappearances. For Jess, it was just the fastest way home. Jess had driven this route countless times, but tonight felt different. The air inside the car seemed heavier, the darkness outside more impenetrable. Her old sedan hummed along the cracked asphalt, the rhythmic thud of tires on uneven pavement her only company. The radio had given up miles ago, dissolving into static, and her phone showed no signal. She rolled down the window, hoping the cool air would keep her alert. It didn't help. It was 1:47 a.m. when she first noticed the truck. Its headlights loomed in her rearview mirror, a pair of piercing orbs cutting through the darkness. Jess assumed it was just another late-night traveler until it got closer. Too close. The truck's grille filled her mirror, its lights flooding the cabin. She squinted against the glare, gripping the wheel tighter. "Okay, pass me already," she muttered, glancing at the speedometer. She was doing 70, a safe pace for this desolate stretch. But the truck didn't pass. Instead, it swerved erratically, edging closer to her bumper. Jess's heart thudded against her ribs. She tapped the brakes lightly, a warning. The truck responded with a blaring horn that sounded more animal than machine. "What the hell is your problem?" she snapped, her voice trembling. She pressed the gas, speeding up to put distance between her and the truck. For a moment, it seemed to work. The lights receded, swallowed by the darkness. Jess exhaled, her pulse beginning to settle. But the relief was short-lived. The truck reappeared, roaring up alongside her. She caught a glimpse of the driver, a silhouette obscured by shadows, but something about the figure sent a chill crawling up her spine. Its head tilted unnaturally, as though it were studying her. Jess's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. She slammed the accelerator, her car protesting with a groan as it surged forward. The truck matched her pace effortlessly, its massive frame dwarfing her sedan, and then it began to drift. The truck veered toward her, its tires skimming the dividing line. Jess swerved to avoid it, her car skidding onto the shoulder. Gravel sprayed against the undercarriage as she fought to regain control. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She glanced to her right. The truck was gone. Her relief turned to dread as she realized the highway was eerily quiet. No headlights behind her, no roar of an engine. It was as if the truck had vanished into thin air. Jess pulled over, her hands trembling as she fumbled for her phone. Still no signal. She debated waiting for another car, but the thought of staying parked on this cursed stretch made her stomach churn. Summoning her courage, she merged back onto the highway. The minutes dragged by, each mile feeling like an eternity. Her nerves were frayed, her mind racing with what-ifs. Maybe it was just a drunk driver. Maybe she'd imagined the whole thing. At 2:13 a.m., she saw it again. The truck was parked on the side of the road, its hazard lights blinking. Jess slowed instinctively, her gaze darting toward the cab. The driver's door was ajar, swinging gently in the breeze. There was no sign of the shadowy figure. And then she saw the blood. A dark, viscous pool spread from beneath the truck, glistening under the moonlight. Jess's stomach twisted. She hit the gas, her only thought to put as much distance between her and the scene as possible. Her car's headlights caught something in the rearview mirror, a figure stepping into the road. It wasn't the driver. It was something else. Tall, impossibly thin, with limbs that seemed to bend in ways they shouldn't. Its head snapped toward her, and Jess swore she saw eyes glowing in the dark. She didn't look back. By the time she reached the next town, the truck and the figure were gone, leaving only a lingering sense of dread. Jess told the local police, but they dismissed her story as the product of exhaustion and an overactive imagination. A week later, a hiker found the truck abandoned in a dry creek bed, miles from the highway. The driver's body was never recovered. Jess never drove Devil's Corridor again. And she wasn't the only one. Stories like hers began to circulate, of phantom trucks, shadowy figures, and bloodstains that vanished with the dawn. No one knew what haunted that stretch of road, but everyone agreed on one thing. If you value your life, don't drive it after midnight. The rain fell in thick sheets, drenching the two-lane road that cut through the dense forest like a dark artery. Sarah gripped the steering wheel tightly, her knuckles pale in the dim glow of the dashboard. She cursed herself for taking this shortcut. but the GPS insisted it was the fastest route, and she was already hours behind schedule. The storm had turned the highway into a nightmare. Visibility was nearly non-existent, the wipers struggling against the onslaught of rain. The trees lining the road loomed like sentinels, their branches clawing at the sky. There were no other cars, no streetlights, just the rhythmic thud of the rain and the occasional crack of thunder. And then she saw it. A figure stood on the shoulder, barely illuminated by her headlights. It was a woman, soaked to the bone, her dark hair plastered to her face. She wore a tattered white dress, and her bare feet stood in a growing puddle. Sarah's first instinct was to drive past, but something about the woman's vacant stare froze her in place. She pulled over, rolling the window down just enough to call out. "Do you need help?" The woman didn't respond. She simply raised one trembling hand and pointed down the road. Sarah hesitated. Every horror movie she'd ever seen screamed at her to drive away, but the woman's eyes, wide, terrified, left her no choice. "Okay," Sarah said, her voice shaky. I'll see what's down there." The woman stepped back, vanishing into the shadows as Sarah drove on. Her heart pounded as the car crept forward. The rain slackened slightly, revealing a turn in the road. That's when she saw the wreckage. A car lay crumpled against a tree, its front end mangled beyond recognition. Steam hissed from the engine, mixing with the mist that clung to the forest floor. Sarah's stomach turned as her headlights revealed a man slumped over the steering wheel, blood streaming down his face. She grabbed her phone, fumbling to dial 911, but there was no signal. Swearing under her breath, she grabbed a flashlight from the glove compartment and stepped out into the storm. The rain was icy against her skin, soaking through her clothes in seconds. She approached the wreck cautiously, calling out to the driver. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. She shone the flashlight through the shattered window. The man's chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, his head lolling to the side. Relief flooded her. He was alive. "I'm going to get help," she shouted, though she doubted he could hear her. As she turned back toward her car, the flashlight caught something in the trees. Movement. Her breath hitched as she scanned the forest. Shadows danced among the trunks, but there was nothing solid, nothing real. And yet, the feeling of being watched was palpable. She hurried back to the car, her pulse racing. But as she reached for the door handle, she froze. The woman was standing in the middle of the road, directly in front of her car. Her dress clung to her body, her hair hanging in limp strands. But it was her face that made Sarah's blood run cold. Her mouth was stretched into an unnatural grin, lips curling back to reveal teeth stained red. Her eyes, once filled with fear, now glowed with malevolent intent. Sarah stumbled backward, her flashlight dropping to the ground. The beam flickered, casting erratic shadows. What do you want?" she stammered. The woman tilted her head, her grin widening, and then she raised her hand again, pointing not down the road, but at Sarah. Before Sarah could react, the woman vanished. Panic set in. She scrambled into her car, locking the doors and slamming the gear into reverse. As she backed away, her headlights illuminated the wreck again. The car was empty. The driver was gone. A low, guttural laugh echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down Sarah's spine. She didn't wait to hear it again. The tires screeched as she sped down the road, the wreck, the woman, and the forest fading into the storm behind her. It wasn't until she reached a gas station miles away that she finally stopped, her hands trembling as she recounted what had happened. The clerk stared at her, his face pale. "That stretch of road," he said slowly, "has been closed for years. They say a woman in white haunts it, luring people to their deaths." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. "They never found her body," the clerk continued, his voice dropping to a whisper, "or the driver who hit her. Sarah never drove that road again. But sometimes on stormy nights, she swore she could see her in the rearview mirror, grinning." The road was deserted, the kind of lonely stretch where the silence became deafening. Jared was on his way home from a late shift, and the clock on his dashboard blinked 2:12 a.m. The fog hung thick, wrapping around the trees and swallowing the headlights. The only sound was the hum of the engine, a monotony that made his eyelids heavy. Then the hitchhiker appeared. Jared saw him just in time, slamming the brakes as the figure stepped out of the fog. The man stood on the edge of the road, his thumb raised in the universal gesture for a ride. He was tall, gaunt, and oddly dressed. wearing a trench coat that looked decades out of place. Jared hesitated. Every instinct screamed to keep driving, but something in the hitchhiker's expression, a look of desperate pleading, made him roll down the window. "Need a lift?" Jared called out. The man nodded, his face pale and drawn. "Thank you. It's a long way to where I'm going." Jared unlocked the door, and the hitchhiker slid in. The man's clothes were damp, and he carried the faint scent of earth, like freshly turned soil. Jared resisted the urge to wrinkle his nose and pulled back onto the road. For a while, neither spoke. Jared noticed the hitchhiker's hands trembling in his lap, his knuckles gnarled and weathered. "Where are you headed?" Jared finally asked, hoping to break the tension. The man turned his head slowly, his eyes hollow and bloodshot. "Home," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Been walking a long time." Jared nodded, unsure how to respond. He kept driving, the fog pressing against the car like a living thing. The hitchhiker stared out the window, his face unreadable. "Strange night to be out walking," Jared said, trying to sound casual. The man didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was distant. "It's a strange road." Jared felt a chill creep up his spine. He glanced at the hitchhiker, who was now gripping the edge of his seat, his knuckles white. "Everything okay?" Jared asked, his voice tinged with unease. The hitchhiker's head snapped toward him, his expression wild. "You shouldn't have picked me up." "What?" Jared's hands tightened on the wheel. "You shouldn't have stopped." Before Jared could respond, the car's radio crackled to life, spewing static. He hadn't turned it on. The noise grew louder, filling the cabin, drowning out his thoughts. Jared reached to shut it off, but the hitchhiker grabbed his arm with a grip like iron. "Don't!" the man hissed. The static morphed into something else, whispers, layered and chaotic. Jared's blood ran cold as he realized they were coming from everywhere, the radio, the vents, even the back seat. "Who's there?" Jared demanded, his voice shaking. The hitchhiker didn't answer. He was staring straight ahead, his lips moving silently as though reciting a prayer. And then the fog parted. The road ahead was gone, replaced by a massive, yawning void. It stretched endlessly, a chasm of inky blackness that seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Jared slammed on the brakes, but the car kept moving, drawn toward the edge like metal to a magnet. The whispers grew louder, turning into screams. Shadows writhed at the edge of the void, their forms indistinct but terrifying. Jared felt his mind bending under the weight of their presence. The hitchhiker turned to him, his face contorted in anguish. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "It's too late now." The car stopped inches from the edge. Jared's chest heaved as he struggled to catch his breath. The hitchhiker opened the door and stepped out, his movements stiff and deliberate. "Where are you going?" Jared called after him. The man turned back, his expression a mix of sorrow and resignation. "Back where I belong." And then he walked into the void. The fog closed in, swallowing the chasm, the shadows, and the hitchhiker. Jared was alone again, the road stretching endlessly before him. The whispers had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. When he finally made it home, he didn't sleep. The next day he checked the news. A report caught his eye. A man's body found buried near the highway. He'd been dead for over a decade. The photo matched the hitchhiker. Jared never drove that road again. But every so often in the dead of night, he would hear the whispers return, faint and chilling, as if calling him back to the edge. The night was cold and starless as Emily drove through the winding back roads of the Appalachian Mountains. Her GPS had failed hours ago, and her phone's battery was dangerously low. She was heading to a friend's cabin for the weekend, but now she wasn't sure she'd ever find it. The road was narrow, lined with thick trees that seemed to lean closer with each passing mile. Her headlights caught a sign as she rounded a bend. It was weathered, barely legible. "Welcome to Black Hollow." She didn't remember seeing it on the map, but the thought of a town, even a small one, was comforting. Maybe someone there could help. As she drove into Black Hollow, unease settled over her. The streets were eerily empty, the houses dark. Her car slowed to a crawl as she scanned the town for signs of life. It looked abandoned, but not in the usual way. There were no boarded-up windows or overgrown lawns. Instead, everything was pristine. Too pristine. She parked her car near what looked like a general store and got out. The air was unnervingly still, and her footsteps echoed as she walked toward the door. She tried it. Locked. She peered through the glass. The shelves were stocked, but there was no one inside. "Hello?" she called out, her voice carrying farther than it should have in the silence. No answer. A flicker of movement caught her eye. She turned to see a figure standing at the end of the street, barely visible in the dim light of the street lamps. It was a woman wearing an old-fashioned dress that fluttered faintly, though there was no wind. "Excuse me," Emily called, relief washing over her. The woman didn't respond. Instead, she turned and began walking away, her steps slow and deliberate. "Wait!" Emily hurried after her. The woman rounded a corner, disappearing behind a row of houses. When Emily followed, she found herself standing in front of a small church. Its white paint was flawless, and the bell tower stood like a silent sentinel against the dark sky. The woman was nowhere to be seen. Emily hesitated. She didn't want to go inside, but something about the church drew her in. The door creaked loudly as she pushed it open, revealing a dim interior lit by flickering candles. "Hello?" she called again, her voice trembling. The pews were empty, but the air felt heavy, almost suffocating. At the front of the church stood an altar, and on it a single book lay open. Its pages fluttered despite the stillness. She stepped closer, her curiosity overriding her fear. The writing was in a language she didn't recognize, something ancient and angular. But as she stared, the letters seemed to shift, rearranging themselves into words she could understand. "They are watching." A chill ran down her spine. The door slammed shut behind her. Emily spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. The woman was there, standing just inside the door. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Who are you?" Emily demanded, backing away. The woman's lips parted, but no sound came out. Instead, she raised a trembling hand and pointed to the window. Emily followed her gaze and froze. Outside, figures stood in the shadows, their faces obscured. Dozens of them, maybe more. They didn't move, didn't make a sound. They just watched. Emily's breath came in shallow gasps as she backed toward the altar. The woman remained still, her arm outstretched. "What do you want from me?" Emily whispered. The candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching unnaturally high. The figures outside began to move, stepping closer to the church in unison. Emily grabbed the book from the altar, desperate for something, anything that might help her. The moment her fingers touched it, the room plunged into darkness. The silence was deafening. And then, a voice. Low, guttural, and impossibly close. "You should not have come," Emily screamed. When she woke, she was in her car, parked at the edge of the highway. The town of Black Hollow was nowhere in sight. She told herself it was a bad dream, a trick of her tired mind. But when she glanced at the passenger seat, the book was there, its cover blank but cold to the touch. And when she looked in the rearview mirror, she saw them, the watchers standing just beyond the tree line, waiting. It was nearing midnight when Daniel turned onto Ridgeway Road, a shortcut through the woods he only took when he was desperate. The route was infamous in his small town, shrouded in whispers of disappearances and sightings of strange figures. But Daniel was running late, and the idea of saving 20 minutes outweighed his unease. The road was as dark and narrow as he remembered, the towering trees on either side forming a tunnel that his high beams barely penetrated. The only sound was the crunch of gravel under his tires. He tried to shake off the creeping anxiety that clawed at his chest. Then he saw the sign. It was old and rusted, barely legible in the dim light. "Dead man's turn ahead. Slow down." Daniel smirked nervously. The stories about Dead Man's Turn were a staple of local folklore, about how a trucker had lost control on the sharp curve decades ago and plunged into the ravine below. Some said his ghost still roamed the road, looking for someone to blame. He didn't believe it. Not really. As he approached the curve, Daniel instinctively slowed down. The drop-off to his right was steep, disappearing into blackness. His headlights caught a faint shimmer ahead. It was a car, parked just off the side of the road. "Who the hell parks here?" he muttered, his pulse quickening. The car was an old sedan, its paint dull and its windows fogged over. Something about it looked wrong, but Daniel couldn't put his finger on it. He slowed to a crawl, peering inside as he passed. There was someone in the driver's seat. The figure was slumped forward, their head resting against the steering wheel. Daniel hesitated, torn between stopping to help and driving on. But his conscience got the better of him. He pulled over and stepped out, the cold night air biting at his skin. "Hey!" he called out, approaching cautiously. "Are you okay?" No response. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up as he got closer. The figure's posture was unnaturally rigid, and their skin, pale and waxy under the moonlight, looked wrong. Daniel tapped on the window, his heart racing. "Hey!" he said louder. The figure didn't move. He tried the door handle. It opened with a creak, and the smell hit him, a sickly sweet stench of decay. Daniel gagged, stumbling back as the figure slowly turned its head toward him. Its eyes were gone. Dark. Empty sockets stared back at him, and its mouth stretched into a twisted grin. Daniel froze, his mind screaming at him to run, but his legs refused to move. The figure raised one hand, its fingers impossibly long and thin, and pointed down the road. "Leave," it rasped, its voice like dry leaves rustling. Daniel didn't wait to be told twice. He bolted to his car, slamming the door and flooring the gas pedal. The tires squealed as he sped away, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the engine. As he rounded Dead Man's Turn, he saw them. Figures lined the edge of the ravine, standing perfectly still. They were pale, their eyes missing, their mouths twisted into the same grotesque grin. They all turned to watch him pass. Daniel didn't stop driving until he reached the safety of his driveway. Even then, he couldn't bring himself to leave the car, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly they ached. The next morning, he told a friend about what had happened. His friend's face went pale. "There hasn't been a car on Dead Man's Turn since the 1970s, he said. "That sedan you saw, that's the trucker's car, the one who went missing after his wreck." Daniel never took Ridgeway Road again, but sometimes, late at night, he thought he could still feel them watching from the trees, waiting for someone else to ignore the sign. It was a moonless night when Karen found herself driving down Route 42, a desolate stretch of highway infamous for its eerie reputation. She had heard the stories growing up, tales of spectral hitchhikers and phantom headlights chasing drivers into oblivion. But she had always dismissed them as urban legends, nothing more than campfire tales to scare kids. She wasn't so sure anymore. Her old sedan rumbled along the cracked asphalt, the radio silent after static overtook her favorite station. The road seemed endless, flanked by thick woods that seemed to lean inward, as though the trees themselves were watching. Her headlights carved a narrow path through the darkness, but the shadows always seemed to creep closer. Karen was exhausted, her eyelids heavy. She glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 1:47 a.m. Still another hour to go. She sighed and reached for her thermos, hoping the last bit of coffee would keep her awake. And that's when she saw it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. Karen's foot slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded to a halt. The figure didn't move. Her heart pounded as she tried to make sense of what she was seeing. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, wearing what appeared to be an old suit. His face was pale, almost gray fog, and his eyes glinted unnaturally in the headlights. Karen hesitated, her hand hovering over the lock button. Something about him felt off. She rolled down the window slightly, just enough to call out, "Do you need help?" The man didn't respond. He simply raised an arm and pointed to the side of the road toward the woods. Karen followed his gesture, squinting into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing, but then something moved. A faint flicker of light deep among the trees, had like the glow of a lantern. "What is that?" she muttered to herself. When she looked back at the man, he was gone. The road ahead was empty, as though he had never been there. Karen's pulse quickened, and she considered turning the car around and heading back the way she came. But the light in the woods caught her attention again, brighter now, flickering like it was calling to her. Against her better judgment, she pulled over. The air was icy when she stepped out of the car, and her breath fogging in the faint beam of her flashlight. The forest was silent, too silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, just an oppressive stillness that pressed against her eardrums. She made her way toward the light, her boots crunching softly on the undergrowth. The trees seemed to close in around her, their gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal hands. As she got closer, she realized the light wasn't a lantern. It was a fire. A small, flickering flame burned in the center of a clearing, but there was no wood, no fuel. It hovered above the ground, unnatural and cold despite its glow. Karen's gut screamed at her to turn back, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. She stepped closer, the flame reflecting in her wide eyes. A voice broke the silence. "Why did you come?" She spun around, her flashlight shaking in her grip. The man from the road was standing behind her, his face more distorted in the dim light. His grin stretched too wide, his teeth sharp and glinting. I thought you needed help," she stammered. His grin widened. "Help? He stepped closer, his footsteps making no sound. You can't help. No one can. Karen stumbled backward, her heart hammering. The flame behind her began to grow, its light pulsating and casting grotesque shadows across the trees. What do you want from me? She whispered. The man tilted his head, his hollow eyes gleaming. You shouldn't have stopped. The flame erupted, blinding her with its brightness. Karen screamed, shielding her face. When the light faded, she found herself back in her car, parked on the shoulder of the highway. Her hands trembled as she gripped the steering wheel, her knuckles white. The road was silent and empty, the woods dark and still. She glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to see nothing but the empty road behind her. Instead, she saw him, sitting in the back seat, his wide grin reflected in the mirror. Karen's scream echoed down Route 42, but by morning, her car was found abandoned. She was never seen again. The rain poured in relentless sheets as Mike drove down Route 89, his windshield wipers struggling to keep up. He had made this trip 100 times before, but tonight felt different. The road was empty, the storm muting every other sound except the rhythmic thud of raindrops and the occasional rumble of thunder. His destination was his parents' cabin, nestled deep in the woods, but the storm had slowed him down. The clock on his dashboard blinked 11:57 p.m. As he passed a mile marker he didn't recognize. He frowned. He hadn't seen another car or sign for miles. And then, out of nowhere, a gas station appeared. Mike hit the brakes, his tires skidding slightly on the wet pavement. The gas station looked ancient, its neon sign flickering erratically. LOP was painted above the door in peeling white light letters. He debated for a moment. His tank was half full, and he didn't really need to stop, but the thought of getting stranded in the storm was enough to convince him. Pulling into the lot, he noticed something odd. There were no other cars, and the pumps looked older than he was, with faded dials and cracked glass. He stepped out of the car, immediately soaked by the rain, and walked toward the door. The bell above it jingled as he stepped inside. The interior was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights buzzing faintly. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with items that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. A thick layer of dust covered everything. "Hello?" Mike called out, his voice echoing. No response. He walked toward the counter, where an old register sat, its keys yellowed and grimy. Behind the counter was a wall of Polaroid photos, each one pinned to a corkboard. Mike leaned in closer, squinting at the photos. They were all pictures of people, men, women, even children. Some were smiling, others looked confused or frightened. His stomach turned when he realized that many of them were standing in front of this very gas station. "Can I help you?" Mike jumped, spinning around to see a man standing behind him. He hadn't heard him approach. The man was tall and thin, his skin pale and waxy. His eyes were dark, sunken pits, and his smile didn't reach them. He wore a stained apron and a name tag that read, Jimmy. Yeah," Mike stammered. "Just wanted to fill up my tank." Jimmy nodded slowly, his head tilting to one side. "Pump 2, he said, his voice low and gravelly. Mike nodded, eager to get back on the road. He hurried outside and began pumping gas, glancing nervously over his shoulder. The rain had let up slightly, but the air felt heavier, like something was pressing down on him. When the pump clicked, he turned to head back inside, but the gas station was gone. He froze. The building, the lights, even Jimmy, it had all vanished, leaving nothing but an empty lot overgrown with weeds. Mike's pulse raced as he stumbled back toward his car. He climbed in, locking the doors, and floored the gas pedal. The road stretched endlessly ahead, but something felt wrong. The storm was gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. The trees lining the road seemed closer, their branches clawing at the sky. Then he saw them. Figures standing along the roadside, their faces pale and expressionless. As he passed them, he realized they were the people from the Polaroids. Mike's hands shook on the wheel as the figures grew more numerous, lining both sides of the road. They didn't move, didn't react, just stared as his car sped by. Suddenly, the engine sputtered. The headlights flickered and went out. Mike's car coasted to a stop, leaving him in complete darkness. He fumbled with his phone, but it was dead. A tap on the driver's side window made him jump. It was Jimmy. His face was inches from the glass, his grin impossibly wide. "You didn't pay," Jimmy said, his voice muffled but clear. Mike screamed, but no sound came out. The next morning, his car was found abandoned on Route 89. The gas tank was full. The night was cold and unnaturally quiet as Sarah drove through the Pine Barrens, a sprawling wilderness infamous for its dark legends and ghostly sightings. Her GPS had rerouted her onto an unfamiliar road after she missed her turn, and now she was utterly alone. The dense trees pressed in on both sides of the narrow path, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Her gas gauge dipped dangerously close to empty, and her headlights flickered briefly before stabilizing. She cursed under her breath. This was the last place she wanted to get stranded. As she rounded a bend, her high beams illuminated something up ahead, an old wooden bridge stretching over a narrow creek. Beside it stood a figure, a man draped in a long coat and wide-brimmed hat, his face obscured by shadow. Sarah's stomach churned. He wasn't waving for help or signaling her to stop. He was just standing there, still as a statue, directly in her path. She slowed the car to a crawl, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. As she inched closer, her headlights swept over him. His clothes were outdated, almost antique, and his boots were caked in mud. When she was just a few feet away, he suddenly looked up. His face was wrong. The skin was pale and waxy, his eyes two black voids that seemed to suck in the light. His mouth stretched into an unnatural grin, revealing teeth that were jagged and far too many. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to floor it, to get away from him, but her body wouldn't move. The man raised a hand, long fingers pointing toward the bridge. "Turn back," he rasped, his voice echoing unnaturally as if carried by the wind. Sarah snapped out of her trance and stomped on the gas. The car surged forward, swerving around him and onto the bridge. The moment she crossed, everything changed. The air grew heavy, pressing down on her chest. The trees on either side of the road seemed taller, their trunks impossibly twisted. The sky, once dotted with stars, was now an inky black void. Her headlights flickered again, and the road ahead began to ripple, like the surface of a disturbed pond. She slowed, squinting through the windshield when she saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing along the roadside. They were cloaked in darkness, their features indistinct, but their eyes glowed faintly, watching her. Sarah's pulse thundered in her ears as she sped up, her car rattling over the uneven road. The figures grew closer, stepping out of the shadows and into her path. They weren't human. Their limbs were elongated, their movements jerky and unnatural, like marionettes controlled by an unsteady hand. Their faces were featureless, except for the glowing eyes, which seemed to bore into her soul. One of them reached out as she passed, its fingers scraping against the car door with a metallic screech. Sarah screamed, swerving to avoid another that appeared directly in front of her. The car skidded, its tires barely gripping the slick road before she regained control. The radio crackled to life, filling the car with a low, guttural voice. "You were warned." Her heart pounded as she pressed the gas pedal to the floor. The car roared forward, the trees and figures blurring into a nightmarish tunnel. She didn't dare look back, afraid of what she might see. Finally, the road ahead brightened. The oppressive darkness lifted, and the familiar outlines of the Pine Barrens returned. Sarah didn't stop until she reached the nearest gas station. She stumbled out of the car, her legs shaking, and ran inside. The clerk looked up, startled. "You okay, miss?" he asked. Sarah tried to catch her breath, her words tumbling out in a panicked rush. There was a man, by the bridge, and these things in the woods. The clerk's face went pale. "You crossed the old creek bridge?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She nodded, confused by his reaction. "That bridge was condemned years ago," he said. "It collapsed in the 80s. No one's crossed it since." Sarah's blood ran cold. She turned back to her car, and her stomach dropped. The passenger side door was streaked with deep claw marks, and pressed into the glass of the rear window was a single blackened handprint. It was nearly 3 a.m. when Jake's car finally gave out on the desolate stretch of Highway 44. The engine sputtered and died, leaving him stranded in a pitch-black wilderness miles from the nearest town. The road was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. Jake cursed under his breath and grabbed his phone, but there was no signal. Typical. He stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand, hoping to find some hint of civilization. The beam of his flashlight swept over the cracked asphalt and the dense forest that bordered the road. In the distance, just beyond the reach of the light, he saw a faint glow. A house, maybe? Or another car? With no better option, he started walking toward the light. The air grew colder as he moved away from his car, and the stillness of the night felt almost oppressive. The glow grew brighter, revealing itself to be a small gas station. Its sign flickered weakly, the letters spelling out Elmer's Stop. Jake felt a twinge of relief as he pushed open the door. A bell jingled, its sound startlingly loud in the silence. The interior of the gas station was dimly lit, the fluorescent lights casting a sickly green hue. Shelves lined the walls, stocked with items that looked strangely out of place. Cans of food with faded labels, glass soda bottles, and dusty candy bars. Behind the counter sat an old man, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He didn't look up as Jake entered. Hey, Jake said, his voice shaky. My car broke down a couple miles back. Do you have a phone I can use? The old man raised his head slowly, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to stare through Jake. His mouth twisted into a faint smile. No phone here, he said in a gravelly voice. But you can stay for a while. Jake frowned. Stay? I just need a tow truck or... Not tonight, the old man interrupted. You'll want to stay off the road. It's not safe after dark. Before Jake could ask what he meant, the bell jingled again. He turned to see a woman standing in the doorway. She was soaked to the bone, her hair hanging in clumps around her face. Her eyes were wide and unblinking, her lips trembling. Please, she whispered. It's out there. Don't let it in. Jake's blood ran cold. The old man didn't react, his gaze fixed on the woman. You shouldn't have come back, he said softly. The woman stepped closer, her bare feet leaving wet footprints on the floor. She grabbed Jake's arm, her grip icy. Whatever you do, she said, her voice barely audible, don't go outside, and don't look at it. Jake stared at her, confused and terrified. What are you talking about? A loud scraping sound interrupted them. It came from the side of the building, like claws dragging against metal. The old man stood up, his movements unnervingly slow. It's here, he said. The woman backed away, trembling. We have to hide. Jake's heart pounded as the scraping grew louder. The lights in the gas station flickered, casting shifting shadows across the room. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from everywhere at once. What the hell is that? Jake whispered. Neither the old man nor the woman answered. The old man simply pointed toward the storage room in the back. Go, he said. Jake didn't need to be told twice. He followed the woman into the storage room, slamming the door behind them. The air inside was stifling, the faint scent of oil and dust filling his nostrils. The woman pressed her ear to the door, her breathing shallow. It doesn't like the light, she said, but it's getting smarter. Jake swallowed hard, his palms sweaty. What is it? Some kind of animal? The woman shook her head. No, it's worse than that. It wears faces. It tricks people. Jake's stomach churned. What do you mean, it wears faces? Before she could answer, the lights in the gas station went out completely. The room plunged into darkness, and Jake heard the sound of the front door creaking open. Footsteps echoed in the silence, slow, deliberate. A voice called out, low and distorted. Jake, come outside. Jake's blood froze. It was his mother's voice. Jake, the voice repeated, closer now. It's me. I need your help. He pressed his hands over his ears, shaking his head. That's not her, he whispered. The woman grabbed his arm, her nails digging into his skin. Don't listen to it. Don't answer. The footsteps stopped just outside the storage room. Then came the sound of claws scratching against the door. Jake held his breath, his entire body trembling. The voice came again, softer this time. Jake, please. It's so dark out here. Let me in. Tears streamed down his face as the scratching grew louder, more frantic. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Jake dared to exhale, his heart pounding in his chest. When he turned to the woman, she was gone. The door to the storage room was wide open, revealing the empty gas station beyond. Jake stepped out cautiously, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The old man was nowhere to be seen. The shelves were empty, the floor covered in deep gouges. And as he stepped outside, he realized his car was gone too. The only thing left was the sound of something breathing in the darkness, waiting. The clock on Mia's dashboard blinked 12:03 a.m. as she drove along Black Hollow Road, a stretch of highway notorious in her small town for its dark history. Her friends had always joked about avoiding it after midnight, but she hadn't believed the stories, at least not until tonight. The road was deserted, surrounded by dense forest that seemed to swallow the faint glow of her headlights. The rain had stopped hours ago, but a thick fog clung to the ground, swirling ominously as she drove through it. She was on her way home from her cousin's wedding, her phone dead and her gas gauge dipping precariously close to empty. Anxiety gnawed at her as she kept an eye out for the turnoff she needed. Then she saw it, a figure standing on the side of the road. Mia slowed her car, unsure of what she was looking at. It was a woman, barefoot and wearing a tattered white dress. Her long hair hung limp and wet around her face, obscuring her features. Mia's instincts screamed at her to keep driving, but something about the woman's stillness held her in place. She rolled down her window slightly. "Are you okay?" Mia called out. The woman didn't respond. She simply raised her head, revealing eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. Her lips parted and a low, raspy whisper carried on the cold night air. "Help me." Mia's skin crawled. She knew she should leave, but guilt rooted her in place. What if this woman was hurt or lost? "Do you need a ride?" Mia asked hesitantly. The woman didn't answer. Instead, she pointed down the road, her arm trembling. Mia followed the direction of her finger, but saw nothing except fog and darkness. When she turned back, the woman was gone. Her heart thudded in her chest as she scanned the road, but there was no trace of the woman. She rolled up her window and pressed on the gas, her nerves fraying with every passing second. As she drove, the fog grew thicker, wrapping around her car like a shroud. Her headlights barely penetrated the gloom, and the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead. Then she heard it. A faint tapping sound coming from the roof of her car. Mia's knuckles turned white as she gripped the steering wheel. It was probably just a branch or some debris, she told herself. But the tapping grew louder, more insistent, until it sounded like fingernails scratching against metal. She pressed harder on the gas, her car lurching forward. "Just get home," she whispered to herself. "Just get home." Suddenly, the tapping stopped. The silence that followed was worse. Mia glanced in her rearview mirror and her blood ran cold. The woman was sitting in the back seat, her glowing eyes locked onto Mia's. Mia screamed, swerving off the road. The car skidded to a stop in a ditch, the engine sputtering before going silent. She turned around, but the back seat was empty. Her breathing was ragged as she fumbled for the door handle, desperate to escape. But when she stepped out of the car, the air was wrong. It was colder, heavier, and the fog seemed alive, swirling around her in unnatural patterns. She heard a voice behind her. "Why didn't you listen?" Mia spun around, but no one was there. The fog thickened, and faint shapes began to form within it. Figures with glowing eyes, their faces twisted in silent screams. They moved closer, their whispers growing louder, overlapping until they became a deafening roar. Mia backed away, but the ground beneath her feet gave way. She fell, her screams swallowed by the fog as the figures closed in. When the sun rose the next morning, her car was found empty, the driver's door hanging open. Locals whispered about Black Hollow Road, adding Mia's name to the growing list of those who had vanished there. And on foggy nights, drivers swear they see her, standing on the roadside pointing down the road, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark.